And welcome to a conversation that Elisabeth Colson from Devry, Smith Frank, and myself, Eric Gilboord, from Warren Business Development Center are going to have today. Based on the webinar that we did about a month ago and the response that we got, it was on the subject of business transition, and we decided that because the response was so great that we would actually break down that conversation into three parts. So today we're going to talk about pre-transition, the next one will be during transition, and the third portion will be post-transition. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm with the Warren Business Development Center, and what we do is we prepare businesses for sale. We increase the value of a company by looking at the operations, finance, sales, marketing, HR, need for capital, kind of a 360 approach to making your company as valuable as possible, and then at the right time when the owner and the business are ready for a successful transition, we will bring buyers to the table. And I'd like to introduce Elisabeth Colson.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everybody. Just to give you a little bit of background as well on our firm, DSF has been around for 54 years. I'm an equity partner here, and I'm head of the corporate commercial group. I've been with the firm for a little over 12 years now, and I've worked in Montreal and Barbados and here in Toronto. And I've held positions both in-house and in private practice. And my practice is very broad-based corporate commercial. I handle anything that has to do with financing, operating, and selling a business with a particular focus on shareholder relationships and mergers and acquisitions. And Eric, I'll let you maybe kick it off.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that one of the best questions to ask to begin a conversation like this is, what do we think is the one of the most important, because it's hard to nail down the single most important thing that an owner operator needs to understand as they're entering into this path of transition. So at the pre-transition stage, and I'll go first. I think that it's really key that owners understand how much they don't know about what they're about to go down, the road they're about to enter. Everything from the value of their company, because inevitably they think it's worth a lot more than it is, the amount of work that they have to do to get that business ready, the amount of work that they're going to have to do in advance with their staff and customers and the basic running of the company. There's just an awful lot that has to be done, and they have no idea at this particular point in time.
And you're right, Eric, and you're talking about it from a very practical perspective, but as well from the sort of structure and planning perspectives, there's tax planning and organization that would go into the business, ideally a period for at least 2 years in advance to get holding companies set up, to structure things to minimize tax and to maximize available tax planning opportunities. Oftentimes we see people who need to bring on new staff, because when you're thinking of transition, you may not want to be there after the sale, and so you have to start getting people familiar with the business if you don't already have somebody within your organization. So there's the planning is very multifaceted, both in terms of what you want the business to look like and the package that you want to present for sale.
Absolutely, and from a timing perspective, your point about a couple of years to get certain things in place, it's interesting. It's not that uncommon that an owner, when we ask them, when are you thinking about selling, when do you think you want to exit out, some folks are realistic and they might say 3 or 4 or 5 years. Some on the other hand say, well, I want out in 90 days, I want out in 6 months, I want out in a year. And it's impossible from a financial perspective, it's somewhat impossible from a legal perspective to do that. The other thing about timing is that they need to understand that many occasions a new owner, a new buyer, wants to buy a business that can run without the existing owner. And in order to get to that point, and typically small and medium-sized companies are run around the owner, the founder of the company. What they need to understand is they need to be able to back away and have their management team and their employees run the company, in their absence, basically. And you don't just turn that on and turn that off. There's going to be a long learning curve in amongst the management and the staff and customers and suppliers that you're, removed from the day-to-day activity.
And that extrication of the owner as well can be an ongoing process. Oftentimes we'll see owners agree to do some consulting for a year or two after the close of the sale. If they want to have a very quick sale, they may find that they have to help with that transition in a much more involved way than they would otherwise have thought. So all this too has to go into the thinking. I mean, is the owner, it's a bit of a hybrid position. The owner suddenly finds himself an employee of the business that he used to run, oftentimes without the ability to make the split-second decisions and the long-range planning that he had been so familiar with. And that takes a certain adjustment too, emotionally and mentally. One of my clients is actually going through a management change now, and as that shift is happening, the people that used to be at the very forefront of the organization are now stepping back and are finding it a challenge that they hadn't expected from almost an emotional standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. I think that that's a key element here. This is not just a business decision, in terms of selling a company. You're going to deal with emotional issues, as you said, and if you've created something and you've been running it for 20, 30, 40 years, there's a good chance that you are not anywhere near emotionally prepared to step away from that kind of an existence. So on another note, let's chat a little bit about a team. And, we think that another area of kind of pre-transition is putting the best team together to help you increase the value of the business and to help you as you move forward through the process during the transition and, in fact, post-transition. But from a legal perspective, Elisabeth, can you talk a little bit about all the different kinds of, skill sets that are required to enter into a successful transition?
Even from the professional advisor's perspective, sure. So you're going to want to have your accounting team around you. You're going to want to have a valuator who can, and sometimes the accountant can do that, but can help put a base value to the business. You'll probably want as well to speak with someone like yourself to see how you can make the business more appealing. Maybe you want to take a little bit of extra time to build up its value. So all of that thinking too should be explored, and so you would be an integral part of the team. You do want the legals there. I know it sounds like a plug for lawyers, but you really don't want to get into a situation where you come to a lawyer, you come to the point where you're about to have signed a purchase agreement and then find that there are things that were unclear, things that the parties had just by simply not knowing the intricacies, neglected to negotiate. Now you're dealing with details when there's a little bit more tension and a little bit more under the gun feeling about it. So you'd want to have your legal team there. You should definitely get tax advice, whether from a tax accountant or a tax lawyer, to know how best to structure the business and to maybe even restructure your own holdings. So it's a multifaceted team, which again, it takes time to put together.
And I'm not sure the average owner has had experience with a tax lawyer and the value that they can bring to the table. And particularly in a case where you are likely, 20% of your income is, 20% of your wealth is what you have right now, and 80% of your wealth is wrapped up in the business. So you're potentially dealing with a huge amount of money that you've likely never dealt with before. And having a tax lawyer to work with a tax accountant is probably very, very necessary.
Yeah, because they come at it from different perspectives. They really do. The documents are one thing, the tax planning is another thing. So they are all pieces of the same whole.
Okay, and let's move on to partners, and we've seen this happen in many occasions. And just to share a short story, we were working with a company, and there were two partners that had been partners for many decades, and family friends. And when it came time to that pre-transition stage where they weren't anywhere near a real transition, they were literally just at the stage of beginning the conversation of doing something with the business and moving on. They couldn't get that initial conversation going. And the reality was that they did not have a partnership agreement. They had nothing to use as a base for moving the conversation forward. So they were basically at a stalemate, where you had two partners and one didn't want to talk about it and one wanted to get out of the business, and he couldn't even get past the first step in the ladder because his partner wasn't interested in talking about it.
And we see that often, and this goes back to almost at the inception of the business, when everybody is friendly, and you should really implement some sort of an agreement at that point, even if it's minimal, to address how do you exit at some point in time. And remember, you don't have to abide by that, but as you say, Eric, it provides a really good starting point for a conversation, because then if one person does want to speak about something and one doesn't, there's still a mechanism in place upon which they can rely.
Absolutely.
So it's an important piece.
So another area that we'd like to bring up is the whole idea of really getting clear on what an owner is looking for in terms of the short, medium, and long term of their futures. Like, why are you even thinking about this transition of your business? Is it because you came to the realization that your kids were not going to take over the company? And in most cases, that is not the real world. If you're sitting there thinking that my kids are just going to take over the business, I strongly recommend that you sit down with your kids and ask them flat out whether they're in fact interested in the business. And I think you're going to be maybe unpleasantly surprised, but you're going to find out that they have their own lives and they're not interested. And at that point, if that's your plan, well, then what are you going to do? So you need to be clear on what's happening around you. You need to understand what it is that you want to do. What we don't want to see is a seller's remorse situation where you go through all this work, and there's a huge amount of work to get yourself and the business and everyone else involved in the business ready for sale. And the last thing you want to do is have either a seller's remorse after the fact and you're kind of lost and don't know what to do with yourself, or you end up being a runaway bride. And that's, happens way more often than a lot of people think. So if you're clear on what you're going to be thinking, what your thinking is in terms of moving forward, perhaps again some help from outside resources to clarify what exactly is on your agenda. Why are you doing this? Is it the right time? Could you possibly wait? Maybe you should speed up. Figure out what it is that needs to happen to make you happy and to make this a successful experience.
And even, Eric, to guide the conversation, because you're quite right, children are almost a natural succession because they are the successor generation. But sometimes, too, you may find that your employees have an interest, or you thought your employees may have been interested, and then realize in speaking with them that they actually they don't have the risk appetite to step up and begin to be owners. You can also sort of test the waters with that, sort of give them shares, give them options, see how they begin to feel and act as quasi-owners, and know whether or not, and then everybody can actually know whether or not that's something that they want to do. So that may open another door for an avenue that you wouldn't have thought was there if you had simply gone down the "my kids will take over" street, which may or may not be accurate at all.
Absolutely. And when you step when you step outside the family scenario and you start talking about, as you said, employees, we've had situations where, in our initial conversations with an owner operator, he's identified Joe Blow as his employee who's going to take over. And when we sat down and had a conversation with that senior employee, what we found he was not in an emotional state to take over. He didn't have the funds, to buy out the business. He wasn't qualified, in fact, to run that company. He was qualified to run the departments that he was in charge of, but he really wasn't qualified to run the company. So that plan was not a realistic plan. And the alternative to that in this particular situation, and this is also something that owner operators might find, is that someone has expressed an interest in their company. They got a call from somebody in the United States, or they got a call from a competitor, or they got a call from someone. And they think that because they had a call, because they had one or two conversations possibly spread over a period of time, that they've sold their company. And it's nowhere near there's no shortcut to doing this. And again, they need to separate the reality from, their fantasy of what's going to happen. I can't, urge you enough to spend time pre-transition identifying who might be the best kind of a buyer, whether it's a strategic buyer or it's somebody to put in some capital to help grow the business, or it's just somebody who can bring perhaps technology or ideas to, to grow the company. You need to think about who would be a potential partner / buyer, and then you need to go out and once you've profiled that, start identifying who some of those people might be. And you'll begin to realize that it's a very long process and it's a very short list of folks who could be the right potential buyers for your company.
And I think, Eric, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. I would add as well that as you're thinking of who you are looking for, you also have to think about what you are willing to do, because some owners find that they'll end up having to finance part of the purchase price. So under what terms? How much money are they willing to risk if they're willing to take payment over time? What type of security would they want for that money? How involved would they want to be in the business if that is in fact the way they're going? So I think that the thinking should be on several parallel lines at the same time, and then I think that would result in the owner being more open to what's available out there.
Absolutely. I think that there's we spent a few minutes talking about kind of the negative and the doom and gloom of selling your company, and there's good news too. I mean, we at our organization have been getting a lot of calls lately from owners who are in their 40s and their 50s, and they're calling up and saying, we're not going to wait to the last minute. We're thinking about a transition of our business 10 or 15 years from now, and and we want to get on the right side of these changes that are happening. Perhaps if we start working early enough, we can get ourselves into a position where we have much more choice in terms of how to transition the business, and possibly we have the ability to transition. Maybe we start off thinking 15 years, and typically that time frame is based on how long they think it will be to cash out with X amount of dollars, because they've determined that that's what they need to move on with their lives. And in some cases, we've worked with clients and shown them that it might not take 10 or 15 years, it might take 5 years to get to where you need to get to, which means you can either reach the goal that you need to reach early and move on and do something different, or maybe in 5 years you decide that you want to go for another 5 and you want to take the business twice the size of what you thought you could do. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's good news on in the conversation about pre-transition. But if you're not exploring, if you're not asking questions, if you're not talking to, that's one of the benefits, I think, in terms of assembling a team. And it's a team of experienced folks, teams that have bought and sold companies, who've been involved, who've been down this road before. It's not just a team of folks that you're working with right now, it's a team that have experience of what you're doing. And this is a long learning process for you, and likely every situation being different, it's also a learning process for the members of the team. But if you can get the conversation going, if you can start asking yourself or having people ask you questions that perhaps you hadn't considered before, you're going to be that much closer. And it's baby steps, but you're going to be that much closer at a successful transition. And at the end of the day, I think that's really what we're talking about doing, is preparing ourselves as early as possible for a very successful transition, however you define what a successful transition is.
And it's true. Everybody's own barometer for that level of success is their own. There isn't a right or wrong. Someone just might want to say, I've had enough. I want to go into a new business. I want to take the money from this one and invest it in something else. Somebody might say, I'm willing to take less money up front than more money over time. So it's not only a financial decision. Going back to your point too about the team, the other surprising advantage in surrounding yourself with these trusted advisors early on is that they can also act as brokers and mediators for you in approaching some of the people that you may find that you would have to deal with down the road. I know an accountant that I know has developed a certain practice niche where he will travel, far and wide to help the child who's living in another in the States or in a different province have a conversation with the father with whom he's become estranged, so that the father may realize that, you know, maybe there is some sort of synergy there, maybe there is a possibility for succession in an area that he wouldn't normally have thought of. So these team members, sometimes because they are divorced from the emotional quotient that comes with the family, can contribute in that way as well.
Well, and it's interesting, I mean, you know, while I like to say that we help increase the value of the company, oftentimes we become a family therapist.
Yeah.
And so from a pre-transition perspective, you know, you may have a scenario where you are the owner operator of the business. However, there's a sibling who has 30% ownership in the company, and you're going to have to deal with that. Or there's 2 or 3 or 4 non-active members of the family that also have some ownership. And the sooner that you bring all those folks together around the table and get it in writing, in a contract, and perhaps you can talk about this a little bit, but get it in a contract as to what the arrangement is and how this company, this group of relatives, if you will, who are you know, entering, you know, down this road of transition, how things are going to work. What you don't need to do is have a buyer at the table and then start your discussion of what's going to happen. I'm sure you've had some experience along those lines.
Yeah, no, very, very much so. And that's why, even though I mentioned before, it's great to have an agreement in place at the outset. As things evolve, it's equally appropriate and still very feasible to put something in place that focuses really on the issues at hand. And it also gives the silent partners comfort that their rights are going to be acknowledged, and maybe they don't want to be so silent when someone else is going to be in charge, or when they're going to be divesting themselves of the interest in something that they've had for however long. So yes, I've certainly worked in situations where we've sort of brought the parties together and we've established how a sale would go and how the proceeds would be distributed and what people's roles would be. And it's been interesting because also in those conversations we've discovered that somebody who was very content sitting in the background while their mother ran the business may not be so happy to do that when their brother or sister is, and has different expectations. And it's far better to flesh those out earlier on among the friendly parties than it is when you're approaching a third party and saying this is an awesome opportunity. The last thing that the buyer wants to see is dissension in the ranks. It's only going to serve to drive the value down.
We were working with 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, and we went around the table because I wanted to understand what ownership was. And you know, one of the brothers said, well, you know, I run one of the 2 locations with my sister, and my spouse is not involved in the business. Okay, great. The second one said, well, I run the other location, but my wife works full-time in the business. And the third one said, well, while I'm running the first location with my brother, let's not forget that my husband's quote-unquote family money helped me to pay for X in terms of the business. So while he's not directly involved in working in the business, he has a real say in what's going to happen. And then you get into the situation of children, you know, next generation. And, you know, while someone may say, I want my son or my daughter to come in and you know, take over my part of the business, or I think they should be the right person to run the company, what if they're totally the wrong person? And what if, you know, what's happening here is you're putting the business in jeopardy, and if there's 2 or 3 siblings or more, or partners, you know, that own a business, it can be a very, very difficult time. And if you wait too long to have those conversations, so I think what we're saying is there's nothing that you can talk about too soon. Yeah. In the whole transition process. And you know, and the obvious question is, so Eric, when you say pre-transition, you know, what does that mean? And the reality is, it actually should be the day you start the business, but oftentimes we're 10 or 20 or 30 years into a business, and most of the time, and no one has really thought about it. So the earlier the better to get those kinds of conversations out of the way. And they're not going to be, let's have dinner and decide this. They're going to be over a period of time, because, you know, we talked earlier about emotion, and we talked about, you know, time to think things through and process things, and that's what's going to happen, is that you have one or two or more folks that are involved in a very, very major decision, and there's going to be a requirement for lots of time to process and conversation to just to get through what it is that they're talking about.
And it'll evolve too. You know, somebody might come to the table and say, well, this is my vision, this is what I think. And because that person may have been used to being the spokesperson of the group, they may find that somebody who was typically more in the background has an excellent point or a different perspective that is well worthy of consideration. So those conversations too can provide resources and ideas that you wouldn't really have anticipated.
And when you're talking about a quote-unquote family business, and in fact it could be work family, it could be blood family, but you know, you're going to continually find yourself in a situation where there's just lots of opinions and lots of things that have to be taken into consideration. You know, and as you said, there may be some folks that have certain visions of what needs to happen with the business. And, you know, I should point out that there is a certain dynamic within any family that goes on outside of a business. So if it's a Friday night dinner, or it's Christmas, or a family reunion or what have you, or it's just family getting together for dinner at any time, there is always a dynamic. There is always a quote-unquote pecking order within a family. There's always certain siblings that will speak their mind and other siblings that won't, and those same dynamics express themselves under the roof of the business. So if you think someone's going to be a certain way in the home and they're going to act differently within the confines of the business, either during this process or after, you're sadly mistaken. You can look to see how they've responded to situations over the years under your family roof, and you'll have a really good idea of how they're going to respond as things move forward. There is always the entitled child. There is always the one who doesn't want to express their opinion. There's always, the middle child who wants to make everybody happy. And that dynamic, it shows itself particularly in the business.
And you can find the same among employees too. You can find that you will get to know your employees on a very different level if you begin having a conversation with them, not sort of, I'm going to sell my business, so if you don't want to buy it, I'm going to go find someone else, and then which will result in all your employees leaving. But just more along the lines of, what are your own future goals? How do you see yourself in this company? What do you see for this company in the next 5 years? And if the employees are going to need some help in terms of getting the financing together to buy the business, you might want to implement a plan early on where they can start to accumulate that wealth even without giving them shares. And there's lots of ways that we can address that and still have them very vested in and remain with the company.
And that's an absolutely key point. I mean, you need to have really good heart-to-heart, one-on-one conversations with your senior management at the moment that you begin thinking about this. And to your point, Elisabeth, I think it makes tremendous amount of sense to have part of that conversation about finding out what the right kind of reward or participation or incentive is for those employees to remain involved and invested emotionally, physically, financially, in the business. So having those conversations, I mean, we spent a number of minutes talking about family, but the work family, the folks that are there, in the office day in and day out, the ones who've helped you grow that business, you absolutely have to sit down and have really deep personal conversations about what it is that they're looking for.
And the team can help with that too. I mean, I've given people talking points, I've given suggestions as to how to approach.